Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Annabelle Dick tēnei, nau mai, haere mai, and welcome to this Infracom presentation on future strategic planning. Today we will be discussing the leading practice and planning for the future. We'll be looking at a couple of future trends, and then we'll be discussing how we're implementing this leading practice into the 30-year strategy development process. So as part of the session today, we will be running a number of polls throughout to gather your feedback. At the end of the presentation, we'll open up the floor to viewer questions. So if you have any questions you'd like to pose to our panelists, please do this by using the Q&A function below. So today on the panel, we have John Grayson, the Chief Executive of Infracom. We have Richard McGeorge, and he is the Lead Special Advisor to Infracom. We also have one of our board members, Stephen Selwood. He is the former Chief Executive of Infrastructure New Zealand. He's also on the line to join us in a Q&A. So if you have any questions for any of our panelists, please pose them to them using the Q&A. Now I'll pass over to John to kick off the session.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Annabelle. So my role here is to give a bit of an overview of Infracom and what we're about before handing to Richard. I'm going to, if you can go to the first slide, Annabelle, I'm going to start with our vision, which is infrastructure for a thriving New Zealand. And I like that because the thriving New Zealand is much broader than economics, though a thriving New Zealand supported by an agile infrastructure system would be a catalyst for productivity, but it's much broader than that. Add in social infrastructure and it's about well-being. In terms of how Infracom is structured, we're an autonomous Crown entity. That means we have independence, and that was an important feature that the sector was telling government as it considered whether to set up an iBody, that was necessary. So we have independence, but we're advisory only. So if we're advisory only, how can we be effective? And I think we can be, and our experience in other jurisdictions suggests we can be as well. And the key is to build credibility with the sector, and that is about ensuring our work is grounded in strong evidence and rigorous analysis. So credibility and influence with decision makers across political cycles. And that's where you come in. We are very keen for our 30-year strategy to have as many fingerprints on it as possible, and in that way it will be more powerful. I'll touch on our legislated functions here, strategy and procurement support. The strategy, the signature product there, I guess, is the 30-year strategy, which we need to deliver by September next year. But along the way, we'll be looking at deep dives, special topic reports, which will feed into the 30-year strategy. Procurement support is about us sitting alongside agencies to help them deliver their infrastructure projects. But it's much broader than that. We will take an interest in the settings around that. Have we got the capability in the sector to efficiently deliver these projects? Are there supply chain constraints, for example? And in this part of our business, the infrastructure pipeline is the signature product. It's a market-facing tool. The market is telling us that that is a really useful tool to give them visibility about projects that are coming to market. But the pipeline is also a good way of illustrating how the various parts of our work come together. I've mentioned on the delivery side, we need to lift capability. We need to have efficient and open supply chains, for example, so that we can deliver these projects. At the other end, if we are to extend certainty about projects coming to market beyond the near term, there needs to be a strategic underpinning, at least so that the market has a broad direction about the sort of projects that will come into the pipeline to replace the ones coming out the other side. We move on to the next one. I think particularly in our first 30-year strategy, it will be about getting the house in order. Now, there's been a great conversation this week in Visionweek about what New Zealand should look like in the future. And that's exciting. And the more clarity we have about that, the more we can tailor our infrastructure strategy, steer it towards achieving that vision. But in the first 30-year strategy, I think the objective will be about ensuring the system is agile, adaptable, resilient to the sort of disruptions that are coming down the path at us, so that it is in a state that it can pivot towards the desired vision. And in looking at some of those challenges that are coming at us, they are, there is a lot of risk around them, but with risk comes reward and opportunity. And so we would hope that our infrastructure strategy can take those disruptions and turn them into an opportunity for the country. We'll look at all infrastructure sectors, and in fact, we already have work underway on the three waters sector and ports, but there will be more to come. Important thing to note, I think, is, and we often revert to central and local government investment, and it is a dominant part of our infrastructure system. But it's not just about that. And in fact, in this country, those two sectors are more dominant than in other jurisdictions, which suggests that there are some alternatives at least available for us to explore. Some of those alternatives might involve non-build solutions. So, pricing so that we get the most out of existing assets. Or it could be a combination of investment and a pricing solution. But it is possible that we could look at more radical reforms which take the burden of investment away from central or local government and put it into a different industry structure and regulatory regime. So they're all the exciting challenges and opportunities ahead of us for the 30-year strategy. At this point, I'll hand over to Richard.
Thank you, John. And thank you, everybody, for taking the time to join us on what we think is a really important discussion. I will spend a few moments just outlining how we anticipate running the next 45 minutes or so. The first part will be to spend some time talking about the changing face of strategic planning and our perceptions around that. And then we want to spend some time talking about how we intend going about the gathering of insights. And it's really important for us to do that in the context of the 30-year strategy, because we have to be mindful consistently about two of our legislative requirements, our statutory requirements, in putting the strategy together. And the first of these is we're required to make a statement about infrastructure's fitness for purpose for the strategy period. And we're also required to make a statement around infrastructure priorities. So we're bound to look forward. And looking forward, particularly given the experiences that we've had most recently with COVID-19, is really very challenging looking over the long term. So we want to talk about that and how we're thinking about approaching that challenge. Next, we'll talk, as part of addressing that challenge, about infrastructure's futures platform is what we're calling it, and we'll spend some time talking to you about the software application we're looking at employing as part of the process of collaborating and co-creating and building consensus around what we anticipate the possible futures to look like and how we interpret those from an infrastructure perspective. So that's really important for us. Now, we intend near the end of the presentation to turn to you and pose a series of poll questions to you, and to be able to seek your feedback on those 3 questions that we intend to pose. Now, in addition to that, if you have questions or if you have observations that you would like to make to us, then please click the Q&A button down the bottom and submit your observations and questions. If we don't have time to get to them in this session, please record them anyway, because we want to have the opportunity to be able to reflect on them later and build those into our thinking. Now, you could be forgiven for wondering why you're looking at a beautiful scene of a golf course. The Jack's Point down in Queenstown, from what I understand. And the big question that we've been posing to ourselves is challenging the idea of typical approaches to strategic planning. The typical approach is really aiming for a hole-in-one. That pin in the distance that you see is essentially trying to make a prediction about a strategic direction, a singular future, and working towards that. And we know before we start out that we'll be wrong. It's just a question of how wrong we will be. To take an example, looking forward 30 years helps us to think about what happened 30 years ago and where we were standing 30 years ago. In 1990, for example, Tim Berners-Lee was just in the process of doing the technical work around the invention of the internet. The invention of the internet. Now, this conversation we're having now on this technological platform, we just couldn't conceive of back then. So it's very challenging to be able to predict with any certainty what the future might hold for us. So how do we develop strategy? We think we need to move beyond prediction to considering possibilities. So it's not about predicting a single future, it's thinking about the range of possibilities, and we'll talk to you about how we plan to go about that. So that's the 30-year strategy that we have in the back of our minds, and one of the anticipations that we have is that in looking at this strategy, we need to be moving beyond the hole-in-one to thinking about trying to get onto the green, and we refer to that as the possibility space. And we'll talk to you about the software platform that we're anticipating using so that we're able to gain a better sense, a better appreciation of what is coming down the pike. The core of all of this is trying to understand a series of insights. So if we turn to the next slide, Annabelle, we'll talk to you a little bit about the fundamental differences that we see between strategic planning typically and strategic foresight and the role of insights. Now, typically, strategic planning involves answering 3 questions. The first is, where are we? And we're doing that in the context of the infrastructure needs assessment. The second question is, where do we want to go? Now, this is the idea of putting the stake in the ground, the hole-in-one, to work towards a predetermined singular future. And then the third question is, how do we get from where we are today to where do we want to go to? Now, that requires prediction, and we challenge that given the current environment and also the nature of the environment that we're moving into, that it's going to be very difficult to predict a single future. So we need to move beyond prediction to possibilities. That's where foresight comes in, because strategic foresight is about imagining multiple possible futures, and from that, we need to determine a subset of plausible futures and make distinctions between, of those plausible futures, what do we prefer and what do we not? And of those preferred possibilities, how do we move towards them? Now, the one thing we know is that the world has become volatile, uncertain, it's ambiguous, and it's complex. Now, this term VUCA was developed in the late 1980s as the US was turning its attention to the collapse of the Soviet Union. All of a sudden, the world was going through a game-changing process, and it seems that we're going through a game-changing process again. So disruption is something that we need to build in to the process along the way. So in taking a strategic foresight approach, we need to understand what's happening now, and we need to be doing horizon scanning to look around and understand what is happening now. We also then need to go to the next stage, which is, rather than determine where we want to go, understand the possibilities of what might happen next. And this is where the role of insight becomes very important to us. Because from that, and this is where the co-creation and the collaboration is so important, because engaging with stakeholders is going to help us identify the possibilities of what could happen. And from that, we then have another question to ask ourselves, which is, what might we need to do in the context of what might happen? And then from that to the next step, well, what will we do? And taking John's point about building disruption and being able to be agile and flexible is going to be challenging, but necessary, particularly for infrastructure assets that last for such a long time and tend to be designed around a single purpose. So the agility, the flexibility, the repurposing of infrastructure, all of these questions we need to take into account. All right, so is this new? If we turn to the next slide, we'll find that while New Zealand is not necessarily leading in the area of strategic foresight, in developing a strategy and infrastructure that adopts strategic foresight, would be a fast follower. Now, the United Kingdom would be fair to say is the high watermark in terms of strategic foresight thinking around infrastructure planning. And it all started around 2009 when the Prime Minister of the time encouraged a debate on what 21st century infrastructure in the UK might look like. And there came this realization that a typical approach was not going to work, and it was necessary to envision a range of possibilities and to start thinking from a systemic viewpoint, a system of systems approach, thinking about infrastructure as not just sector by sector, but a series of sectors that all contribute to one system, and that system provides services to people. So it's the infrastructure services and the outcomes that the UK really started to focus on. Now, development banks have started to cotton on to the idea of strategic foresight, and the Asian Development Bank in April this year published a report, the cover of which you can see there, around the need for strategic foresight for policymakers throughout the Asia-Pacific region. Australia has also adopted foresight for some regional planning, and it's fair to say that Canada has also been leading in this respect by adopting foresight approaches in relation to city planning and thinking about future cities. So we wouldn't be first, we're in good company, but we would be a fast follower in taking this approach, because this is likely to help us understand what the possibility space is rather than determine a singular future. Now then, moving to the next slide, Annie, the question for us now is, if we're trying to determine insights, how do we do that? And how do we do that together? Well, we have a range of thoughts around that, and we're adopting, if we turn to the next slide, Annie, this concept around a futures cone, which has been driven by Future Cities, Canada rather, and it's driven by some work that was done in Australia in the early 2000s. This idea, an analogy would be to think about being in our car at night with the headlights on, shining out into the distance. What we see in front of us is easy to see. We can predict it, we know it, it's easy to determine. Further out, it's more diffuse. There are a range of possibilities we can't see with the same degree of clarity. So in thinking about this realm of possibilities, it's like a constellation of possibilities, really. We can start to categorize those possibilities into a series of categories, such as what is possible? What are the possible futures? Now, from that, we need to then think about a subset of possible futures. What's plausible? What could happen? What do we all think about that? And then from that, a further subset. What's probable? What is a probable set of futures and possibilities? And we see on the right in that circle there a whole range of possibilities that could be trends, or they could be emerging issues, weak signals, and generally possibilities, this constellation of possibilities that we then are able to filter down to a set of plausible possibilities to help us gain insights. Now from that, we need to stand back and say, well, what do we prefer? And what are the things that we don't prefer? And that's where we come back to our analogy of the green and the pin on the golf course. That subset of preferred futures are the futures towards which we might steer through interpreting for infrastructure, understanding the implications for infrastructure, and then making clear decisions about how we move towards that possibility space. So down the bottom here, you see a small flow chart. This is essentially the process that we're working through at the moment. We're in the preparation phase. We're now starting to engage to talk about the conceptual level of the work that we're doing. And together then, we need to start thinking about the identification of possibilities, and then the categorization of those possibilities for likelihood and preferability. And then we need to answer the question with an infrastructure lens. So what does that mean for infrastructure? So if we turn to the next slide, Annie, we're thinking about the development of a platform that acts as a basis for collaboration together so that we can crowdsource and channel as many ideas as we can so that we can do that interpretation. If we were to turn to the next slide, and that platform, by the way, I think is Dunedin rail platform, but this is a different kind of platform that we're thinking about. We're on this video. We noticed before that we had some audio problems, and if the video audio does not play, then I'll do a narrative over the top to give us an idea of what's happening. Thanks, Annie. So the tool was a tool that is, I can tell the audio is not running. So the tool was a software application that's browser-based, that's developed in Finland. Now Finland's important because the University of Turku in Finland has got the largest future studies program. And from that has been a lot of futures thinking about strategy, strategic foresight, and how to try and interpret very challenging futures. This tool was developed in Helsinki, and we're looking at using it so that we can work together to identify a series of possibilities so that we can go through that process of whittling them down. I think here's an opportunity for everyone to see if there's a spelling mistake up there in that development. The idea is that this tool takes a series of possibilities, and there are over 700 in the database of possibilities, and we can add our own as well to customize possibilities. And for each of these possibilities, we can drill down on content so that we can understand what each possibility means. And from that, we can then move to the next step, which is determining the likelihood and the preferability of each. Now, on this slide, you'll see that there are a range of phenomena. They are called in the Futures platform, but we're calling them possibilities. We can add in our own, and we already have been adding in quite a few of our own as we try to understand the realm of future possibilities. And from that, we then work with stakeholders to collaborate with our team of stakeholders to crowdsource your opinions and to help identify priorities. On the right-hand side there, you'll see a chart, a BCG type chart, which is based on the likelihood and the impact of certain possibilities. And for each of those possibilities, we then are able to place them somewhere, and the top right-hand quadrant is what would be particularly interesting to us. High impact, most likely possibilities, and then we need to make a determination, if we drill down a little, to think about what are those possibilities that we all prefer, and what are those possibilities that we don't prefer. And then there's a big question, which is, well, so what about those possibilities for infrastructure? We need to go to the next step. We need to drill down on each of those possibilities to bring them from a large set down to a workable subset so that we're able to look at each of those possibilities and interpret for infrastructure. So to take an example, and looking at the next slide, for example, we've plucked one out of the air, and in this case, it happens to be satellite broadband. Now, this is just an illustration, and we don't have a particular view on it. This graphic that you see on the screen is really indicative, but it helps us think about the cause and effect relationship the positives and the negatives that might occur from a particular possibility if it were to evolve. Now, satellite broadband is being developed by a number of companies, Amazon, for example, SpaceX's SpaceLink project, which has already got 60 low Earth orbiting satellites in space, and OneWeb out of the UK, are all exploring the idea around low Earth orbiting satellites delivering very high-speed broadband around the world. Now, what do we think about that? Well, there are a range of implications. That's really the next step, is thinking about the implications. So, for example, one implication for New Zealand could be access anywhere, and that's appealing, particularly for primary industries, for rural productivity, technological advances, and the social benefits we might obtain from that. I'm not sure whether we all want to have high-speed broadband at the batch, but the way that we work now, maybe that's a possibility that's really appealing. But there are some other sides as well that would need to be thought through. You know, for example, what are the implications from a national security viewpoint? How would New Zealanders feel about third parties providing that type of access to New Zealand? What are the implications from a privacy viewpoint? What's the effect on security partners, as an example? Are there health considerations we need to think about? And then what about stranded assets? What do we think about the significant investment that we've already made in high-speed broadband fibre and the implications for the fibre network? What about the implications for our undersea cables that we have spent considerable amounts of capital on? What are the implications for existing providers of those services? So all of these things need to be thought through so that we can understand what the implications are for infrastructure to help us with insights that help then lead us to being able to provide help to policymakers. Now that's just one dot, and we would need to do that for each of the dots. And so that's a challenging task, and it's one that we look forward to sharing together. Now, if we're then to move on to the next section, if you wouldn't mind, Annie, we want to talk to you about your thoughts on the future and to understand three aspects. The first is to understand your aspirations for the future and to look at your aspirations, just thinking personally, your aspirations for the future and the role that infrastructure might play in meeting your aspirations for yourself, for your friends, for your family, and for all of New Zealand. So the first question that we'd like to pose to you is, what do you see as the two best ways infrastructure can help deliver the future you want? We're asking you to select just two, and I'll run through each of them because each has a different dimension. The first is a social dimension. So if you think that access to good services so that you can live and work where and when and how you want, that might be a choice you want to make from a social perspective. If you think that ramping up the use of technology is one of the best ways for infrastructure to deliver the future that you want, that you determine for yourself, then click on that box. If you think, like many of us do, about the importance of getting ahead for our family and improving your productivity and the role of infrastructure, the way it will help you improve your productivity to save you time and money, tick that box. If you think that it's the environment and resilience that's most important, it's sustainable infrastructure that can withstand what the future is going to throw at us, then tick that box. Now, of course, we might want to tick all the boxes, but we're asking you just to choose two and to make the trade-offs that you make personally in your aspiration for your future. Now then, from a political and governance perspective, if you think that less red tape to unlock infrastructure's true potential is really what is necessary for us to meet your aspirations, then tick that box. And if you think none of the above and that something else is necessary, I would like to hear about that as well. So please tick that box too. Annie, how are we going?
Thank you, Richard. We'll give another 15 seconds if you can get your votes in, and then we will close the poll.
I'm really looking forward to the results of this one, John, because you know, when I went through it, I wasn't. It was very hard for me to make a decision. Well, how about that? That's really very helpful. Thank you. So, sustainable infrastructure that can help withstand what the future might hold. And that really is, I guess, an underpinning of the importance of sustainability, resilient infrastructure, the acknowledgement of disruption in front of us. That's really important for us to bear in mind. And I guess second place winner would be access to good services, so I can live and work when and where I want to.
Yeah. I guess that's about connected communities. So does that result surprise you at all?
Not actually, to be honest. I felt that the first one would get a slightly higher rating and the environmental one would have a slightly lower rating, but that they would still be the top two.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much. And 2%, none of the above. So we'd like to hear what your thoughts are. 2%. So please make your observations in the Q&A. Now that you've expressed your aspirations for the future, we know that there are threats to your future, to our future. So we want to understand what you perceive those threats to be in relation to infrastructure. So again, through an infrastructure lens. So the question is, what could get in the way of your aspirations, the ones that you just expressed, for New Zealand's infrastructure? Again, please select no more than 2. All right, so the first answer, the threat, if you like, is infrastructure's inability to respond to the pressures of urbanisation, population growth, and ageing. So if you think those elements are what really stand between where we are now and where your aspirations for the future sit, then tick that box. If you think that the big threat is if infrastructure doesn't keep up with technology, then New Zealand will fall behind in relation to your aspirations, then tick that box. And if you think that the big threat is around our productivity and our ability to be able to trade effectively internationally or trade effectively generally, and you worry about that aspiration being let down by infrastructure, we can't keep up, tick that box. And then from an environmental viewpoint, if you think that if we fail to have infrastructure that mitigates and adapts well enough to meet climate change and disaster risk, then please tick that box. And then politically, if you feel that geopolitical instability, the risk of geopolitical instability, shifting the focus away from the opportunity to get our infrastructure right, that it's lower down on the agenda, then please tick that box. And again, if the 2% or others feel that none of the above are really threats, the major threats to being able to meet our aspirations with infrastructure, then please tick that box, and we want to hear from you as well. How are we going, Annie?
We're going well. We'll give the poll another 15 seconds and then we'll close it.
Probably a lot of people are hoping that it was on all of the above box, but
we weren't going to make it that easy.
No.
And the winner is? Infrastructure's inability to respond to the pressures of urbanisation, population growth and ageing. And I guess we've been feeling those strains for some time, haven't we? And I guess with the current environment, those things just get amplified to some extent, don't they?
Yeah. I wonder whether that result, we'd get that result if we had an audience somewhere else in the country. I'm suspecting that Auckland is dominating. Yeah, be interesting.
That's possible. Maybe, as we run our regional workshops and so forth, we're able to ask similar questions and to be able to boil down the answers.
Yeah.
So then the environmental question is also prominent again.
Yep.
So that's very helpful. Okay, and then the flip side of that, of course, is around the opportunities to be able to meet our aspirations and our opportunities, particularly around from an infrastructure viewpoint. So if we put that question up, Annie, the question is, what ways do you think New Zealand's infrastructure can best enable your aspirations? And again, please select no more than 2. So again, we have a social, technological, economic, environmental, and political dimension to the question. So do you think that the best way to meet your aspirations through infrastructure is to use infrastructure to improve social equity? This is essentially a theme around infrastructure for all. so that no one's left behind, that access to services is something that everybody enjoys at a cost-effective level. And then the next one is around technology and technology's role in infrastructure, so that more interconnected infrastructure is the way you think will enable better value for money, better deployment of infrastructure services to be able to meet your aspirations. And then the third one is around funding, finding the economic dimension, that finding alternative funding sources and innovative ways to finance new builds is really the opportunity for us to be able to meet our aspirations through infrastructure. So essentially by that, if you were to choose that, you would be saying, we think that the deployment of capital is really what stands in the way between where we are now and where we want to be. And then the next one, from a political viewpoint, really, is a governance viewpoint, is if you think that improving policy, legislative and regulatory settings, the enabling environment is most important, or one of your two choices for how we get from where we are now to meet your aspirations, then please tick that box. And if you think that all the other options are not meeting your needs, then please click on none of the above, and we'd be interested in hearing about that. How are things looking there, Annie?
We'll give it another 15 seconds and we'll close the poll.
Okay, lovely. Thank you for that. I'm not sure which of these I would choose.
No. Okay.
I think I might have missed out the commentary on the environmental outcomes in our ageing infrastructure and the role that presents an opportunity for us. But others read that in any event, and thank you for that. So we've managed to double none of the above from 2% to 4%. So we really do want to hear from you. Okay, so that's really helpful for us. So a focus on ageing infrastructure to support environmental outcomes, both in what we and how we build. 62%, that's pretty strong showing as well.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And then a little more muted on the others around social equity. It's good to see that we actually care about having a quality of services, and that's good to see. And the role of technology bubbles through there, John.
Yeah. Yep. Not surprising, I guess. Yeah.
Not so surprising. So that brings us to a close on our polls, and I guess there's some time for some concluding thoughts before we then open up to questions and answers. And for me, the messages that we'd like to pass on to you and the thoughts we have is that strategy versus foresight is really around aiming for a single predicted future versus accepting that there are multiple futures, and there is an important role for us in trying to understand what those possibilities are. So we need to move beyond trying to predict outcomes. I know it's a natural human tendency to do that. It's important for us to be open to possibilities, but we also need to be grounded in thinking about possibilities as well. So a blend between healthy cynicism on one hand, and on the other hand, a degree of being open-minded to possibilities. Then, as a further thought, we need to find ways to identify and steer towards preferred outcomes, and to develop tactical approaches about how we achieve that, bearing in mind that disruption is a major theme all the way through. So thank you for your time. I think we have time for some questions now, and we're very interested in those, and we'll answer those as best we can. If we don't get to them all, again, we're really interested in understanding your questions and your observations. Over to you, Annie. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So that brings the presentation part of the session to a close. We'll now move to questions. Richard, here's a question for you. Will the Commission use scenario modelling technology to compare development strategies? Well, we haven't got there yet. I think the broad answer is yes, because we anticipate that further down the line, once we've understood the realm of possibilities and we've been able to distill down to plausible futures, and we're able to understand preferences around those. From that, we anticipate that there will be a series of visioning, which could lead to a series of scenarios. So they would be informed scenarios.
So along the way, we're looking at appropriate tools to use this in each step. And so we anticipate that, particularly in the 30-year strategy, scenarios will be important to us. The ideal, of course, is to be able to, we talk a lot about digital twins and so forth, and these things are very appealing. We are very interested in a systemic approach, to understand the interrelationships between one sector and another. But in broad terms, we will look at appropriate tools for the big questions that we're asking at each stage of the strategic process. And if using simulation and scenario modelling as part of it is what we need to do, then we'll certainly look at that.
Thanks, Richard. And a question for you, John. Does Infracom advise on public-private partnership community-based projects? Public procurement requires government guarantees, so can the Infrastructure Commission assist?
Certainly, so I mentioned the two broad areas that we operate in, strategy and procurement support. Certainly, public-private partnerships are a big part of our major projects area. In fact, we're the guardians of the public-private partnership model in New Zealand. But we think more broadly than just the PPP model when we're looking at what is the appropriate delivery model for infrastructure. PPP is just one way of allocating risk appropriately between the Crown as the procuring agency and the private sector contractors. So one of the things we would like to do is really to broaden the the toolkit we've got available to us for delivery models, if you like, and starting with what is the outcome we're trying to achieve. I go back to a point I made earlier. In fact, procurement itself might not even be necessary if there are other tools available to achieve the outcome.
Thanks, John. And here's a question for you, Richard. Is it worth investigating implausible and impossible futures? Is there a risk of blinkered and entrenched thinking if you only think of the possible and likely?
It's a really good question. And the answer is, it is important to think about possibilities and then to think about the likelihood around that. And so it is quite possible that a series of possibilities as part of this constellation could be considered to be impossible. And who's making that determination? So it is important for us to be looking at the full realm of possibilities and then to be grounded in the way that we approach them. And you're absolutely right. The intention is not to be blinkered. The intention is to get that balance right between being grounded on one hand but open-minded on the other. And so by taking this approach, understanding the possibility space, yes, that's what we intend doing with you. The other thing is about the preferred and the non-preferred. Yes, it is important to identify the non-preferred. What are the things that we want to steer away from? And what are the decisions about what we will do to steer away from those things? We need to understand those as well. So it's not just about the preferred. That's a very good question. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. And here's a question for anyone on the panel. Where does the need for adaptive leadership and the recruitment of this capability fit into the strategy?
So I think that's, so where does it fit? It's really important, and all of the aspects that go together to get an agile, capable infrastructure system have got to come together. Maybe if I just use an example, we have publicly advocated for reform in the water sector. We think that is an area where to get better consumer outcomes in terms of quality and long-term cost, that, you know, it's a scale utility business. One of the reasons why you can get better outcomes from that sort of model, we believe, is that by having an entity of scale, the right structure with the right regulatory regime around it, we will attract the sort of capability to deliver on those outcomes.
Thanks, John. Richard, here's a question perhaps you could answer. There are certain things that are not a matter of opinion. For example, climate change threat. A failure to build resilience to cope with those challenges could be deadly for young people and for those who are not yet born, but they aren't able to participate in a consensus-driven exercise. How do you intend to overcome the inevitable presentist bias from sourcing consensus from current generations?
I think that's a really important question from a stakeholder perspective, and one of my colleagues might want to answer that. It is clear that we're making efforts that will affect the next generation, and consequently we need to understand the perspectives of the next generation. So I think that's really important to try and avoid bias. That's why it needs to, the consensus building needs to be inclusive and involve all demographics. John, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I do. So whilst the consensus, the collaboration, the co-design is going to make our strategy much more powerful with decision makers across time. This is not just about us collating a whole series of opinions, packaging that up and presenting it to Parliament. We've got to be thought leaders as well. And where evidence and rigorous analysis suggests something different to a prevailing view, we've got to call that out and challenge that. So please don't take away from this that all we'll be doing is trying to collate a series of opinions.
Thank you, John. I'll open up this question to the whole panel. How do you identify stakeholders when infrastructure is typically unsexy for most people who don't realise they rely on it?
So, Annie, I'll kick off on that if you like. And I think the key to that is to you know, what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve out of it, rather than what projects do we need to build. That's not the starting point. At the end of the day, it's what outcomes, and those outcomes are about how everyday New Zealanders' lives are impacted. Can they move between their workplace, schools, health facilities easily, for example? So it's a matter of the way the questions are asked, framing them in terms of how does the infrastructure system deliver for everyday Kiwis.
We were laughing recently about a quote from Margaret Thatcher, weren't we? Which was, you and I might arrive by train and economists arrive on infrastructure.
Yes.
And we have to be mindful that you know, we take infrastructure for granted, and the services that come from infrastructure for granted, and in a way that's how it should be. And yet it's the service dimension that's so important, rather than necessarily the physicality of the infrastructure. Yeah. So we need to keep the service delivery towards human well-being and the other objectives in mind. That was a great quote from Margaret Thatcher, wasn't it?
Richard, here's a question perhaps you could answer. Waka Kotahi is looking to use the Futures platform as we develop our foresight program. What opportunities might there be to share scenario work and insights?
Oh, that's a great question, because we're all finding our way on this really, and I think so there's an opportunity to collaborate in terms of talking about the tool and how it's used and how to get the best out of it. And I think from that as well, there's an opportunity to discuss different possibilities and our perspectives on them as well, because it's crammed full of possibilities and we're making our own too. So One thing that the Futures platform does is it shares these radar, these circles with possibilities on them, and that might be an area. We know that some others are looking at this application as well, so there have got to be good opportunities for navigating through this together.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, I think I saw a comment come up on the chat bar there, Annie, from Phil Guernsey from New Zealand Defence Force, saying that that they use a similar tool. To me, that's reassuring. There's a good parallel, I think, between our infrastructure system and our defence system. We're both looking at very ambiguous futures with lots of potential for disruption along the way. So that's reassuring, and perhaps, Phil, we need to connect.
We'll take another about 3 questions before closing the session. Here's a question for anyone on the panel, perhaps John or Richard, you might be interested in answering this. What are the opportunities to do more experiments in developing new infrastructure to better understand what will work for New Zealand given the uncertainty of the future?
So I'm quite attracted to the idea of pilots. One of the, I might have mentioned up front that I think, to get to where we need to be up for bold reform. Bold reform is fine to talk about in theory, but when governments face the ones who have to implement those bold reforms, it's not so easy. So just as important as coming up with the bold reforms and making the case for those bold reforms is providing governments with an achievable pathway to those reforms. Now, that achievable pathway might involve staged implementation. It might involve pilots or test cases in certain regions. So yeah, whoever made that point, I think it's a great one. It gives us an opportunity to see, before we roll it out nationally, how a particular solution might work. Is it effective? What are some of the the downsides we need to cover off before we go the whole hog? It also allows us to fail early if it's not going to work, and in a small way.
Thank you, John. Richard, perhaps you could answer this question. What role will design thinking play in this work?
Well, I think design thinking is important, bearing in mind that we have a lot of existing assets as well that have already been designed. So I think design thinking will have its place. We need to think about that. We also, I think, really importantly, need to be thinking about infrastructure as a holistic system, and all working towards the delivery of services to people and to productivity. And so if design thinking can play a role in that, then that's something that we need to be considering. So yes, bearing in mind that much of our infrastructure is already existing and embedded, and to the extent that we can build design thinking around that, then that's certainly worth considering. There's certainly a trend in that direction.
Thanks, Richard. And we'll close with this final question. Perhaps you might like to answer this one also. On the strategic foresight topic, when on track towards a preferred future, how do we assess if we are on track towards that once we're underway? More importantly, if we are not on track, has the foresight process sufficiently explored other options, such as could we switch tracks if needed?
I think this is where it comes back to agility and flexibility in our infrastructure. Infrastructure is designed generally to last for a long time. It has a long economic life, and we need to have in the back of our minds the risk of stranding of assets that might become redundant by being too inflexible. On the other hand, if we have short-lived infrastructure, then that can be highly consumptive as well. So we need to be concerned about sustainability issues. So it's going to be a balancing act. We anticipate that there will be disruption along the way, so we need to be able to design agility into the process. The other thing we need to think about is doing the strategy not as pieces of work in time, but through time. That that it's an evolving process as well. And then a final thought is that we need to be conscious of feedback loops where an outcome that hasn't been anticipated occurs, and that then becomes an input for the future. A good example is ride sharing. Uber and Lyft as examples wouldn't exist if GPS hadn't been established in the early 1990s and smartphones came later. If those two technologies didn't exist, we wouldn't have ride sharing. So there are feedback loops. So we need to be, I guess, through all of this, we need to be constantly updating and thinking about how to change direction as we go. John, does that seem fair?
Yeah, I think so. And I'll just go back to a point I made in the presentation, which is I think there will be a large element of this 30-year strategy of getting the house in order. And getting the house in order means an adaptable, resilient, agile system that can cope with the sort of disruptions that come down the track at us. So the ability to change direction in the light of new information or new dynamics.